Even if my own father were an heretic, I would personally gather the wood with which to have him burned. Paul IV, Pope and Inquisitor. For 450 years, secrets and terror were an integral part of the Roman Inquisition. It still exists to this very day. We are the first film team in the world to go through the files of the Inquisition in order to seek the truth behind the dark legend. This man holds one of the most unusual offices in the world. Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger is the prefect of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, the successor institution to the Roman Inquisition. He works in the Palace of the Holy Office in Rome, a place where secrecy is highly prized.
It's a secret organization that is only rarely in the public eye, but wields incredible power. This was true then even more than now, but it's still true today.
Here in this palace, the same church trials are held that were formerly entrusted to the Inquisition. However, no one likes to hear the term Inquisitor.
The historic court of the Inquisition no longer exists, but there is still an inquisitorial trial. Whoever expresses his opinion publicly, rather than merely in the church, is removed from his position and silenced.
The archives of the Roman Inquisition in the Palace of the Holy Office are like a living organism. Even now, every day, highly explosive files are started here that concern a question of great importance to every Catholic. What shall happen to those who stray too far from the one true faith?
Matthew chapter 18 shows us how the early church dealt with similar problems. If a one-on-one talk does not help, it suggests that the congregation speak with the transgressor, and finally, if he neglect to hear the church, let him be unto thee as an heathen man.
Cardinal Ratzinger is the man entrusted with carrying on the legacy of the Grand Inquisitors. As a young man, he played a major role in bringing about a dramatic change in the former Inquisition. Now he has succeeded his former adversary and powerful opponent, Cardinal Alfredo Ottaviani. He is the last pro-prefect of the Holy Office, the last of the Grand Inquisitors. In the archives of the Inquisition, a precious bronze bust reminds us of the man who 50 years ago undertook to keep alive the old methods of the Inquisition in the modern age. In him, triumph and failure enter into an odd union. Cardinal Ottaviani's story leads us to Italy. In the years after the Second World War, and the end of Mussolini's fascist dictatorship. The Catholic Church faces a new challenge: communism.
Wie heißt du denn, Prinzessin?
Sophia.
Sophia? Ist ja wirklich ein Prinzessinnenname.
Ich heiße Millie.
Millie. So heißen nur Landstreicher. Aber dafür hast du das schönere Kleid, Millie.
Gütiger Gott, das heilige Offizium. Wir alle leben hier friedlich und gottesfürchtig. Es ist ganz unnötig, dass ihr hier...
Meinst du, das heilige Offizium verschwendet seine Zeit?
Nein, nicht doch. Es ist nur so viel Trubel hier. Sie sehen doch selbst.
Du hast recht. Was gibt es Schöneres, als das heilige Sakrament der Ehe zu feiern? Nachher mag Zeit genug sein, die ernsten Dinge zu bereden.
Die ernsten Dinge?
Weißt du nicht, in welchem Schicksalsjahr wir leben? Wenn die Kommunisten die Wahl gewinnen, mag dieser herrliche Wohnort des Herrn bald als Stall für Ziegen und Schweine herhalten.
Was kann ein armer Diener Gottes da tun?
Gott hat dir große Verantwortung verliehen. Die Predigt kann eine mächtige Waffe sein, die verirrten Schafe vor den Wölfen zu retten. Die Kommunisten schrecken nicht davor zurück, ihre gottlosen Stimmen in deiner Kirche zu erheben. Und du? Was tust du, um die schutzlose Herde zu verteidigen?
Das ist Antonio. Na, wie fühlst du dich?
Du warst wohl bei den Partisanen.
Ja,
Und was für ein tapferer Kerl.
zweimal verwundet. Aber den Deutschen haben wir es gezeigt, Monsignore.
Und Kommunist bist du sicher auch bei den Partisanen geworden.
Ja.
Was suchst du dann an diesem heiligen Ort?
Ich bin der Bräutigam. Es ist meine Hochzeit.
Eben noch da draußen hat er Gott gehöhnt und kommunistischen Wahlkampf gemacht. Und du willst ihn trauen?
Ich kenne Antonio doch. Ich habe ihn getauft. Er ist ein anständiger Junge und ein guter Christ.
Als Kommunist steht er außerhalb der Kirche. Und er entweiht das heilige Sakrament der Ehe.
Wer sagt das?
Du wagst es. Die Hochzeit findet nicht statt.
Von der großen Politik verstehe ich nichts. Die Kommunisten sind sicher Träumer, vielleicht sind sie sogar gefährlich, aber ich bin hier geboren, ich kenne hier jeden, kann für jeden die Hand ins Feuer legen.
Du scheinst den schwierigen Aufgaben in diesem gottverlassenen Ort nicht gewachsen. Ich werde dafür sorgen, dass du eine geringere Bürde erhältst, die dir mehr entspricht.
Ich soll in die Verbannung, nach 50 Jahren Priesteramt.
Alfredo Ottaviani, assessor of the Holy Office, is a man with two faces. His love of children is almost legendary. He donates nearly his entire income to orphanages. On the other hand, Ottaviani is consumed by a fanatical hatred of communists. He sees himself as a kind of God's policeman, a carabinieri of the Lord. For the Catholic Church, communism has grown into an enemy of unexpected magnitude. The Soviet Union has emerged from the Second World War as a superpower. Marxism and atheism are the pillars of communist ideology. Religion is condemned as opium for the people. The Soviet Union exported ideology to its satellite states. In some places, churches are converted into storage halls and bishops forced to become farm workers. But in Western Europe too, especially in Italy and France, millions of people joined communist parties. If they should win national elections, the result would be a rejection of the Western Alliance and an expansion of the Soviet Empire. In this period, Ottaviani gains a close associate, Gilberto Agostoni, the son of a Swiss customs official. This man will soon find himself in the center of the international political arena.
I was an innocent country boy who came to Rome on June the 26th, 1950. That's how it all started. I gradually climbed the ranks and became his private secretary. So I knew the cardinal very well, and he slowly granted me more and more access, also to his family and his apartment. I worked a lot with him at his home. It was very hard work, but I did learn a lot.
Agostoni's superior, Ottaviani, also has a stunning career behind him. He comes from a family of bakers in Rome. With great perseverance, he has worked himself up from humble beginnings, almost all the way to the top of the Holy Office. Even as Inquisitor, he sees himself as a man of the people.
He led a very simple life, a truly transparent life. He was very humble, and naturally so. It was not a front he put on. That made him very easy to get along with. However, in his work, he was a very strict man. He was definitely the boss.
In 1948, it seems virtually certain that the communists will win the national elections in Italy. In their campaign, they avoid attacking the Catholic Church directly. For Ottaviani, they are nothing but wolves in sheepskin, worse than fascists.
He always used to say, a white dictatorship can be tolerated, but a red one cannot. You can live with a white dictatorship, but not with a communist one.
Priests sound the call for a holy battle against communism and speak of bishops as generals and priests as captains. Ottaviani transforms the Holy Office into a kind of anti-communist intervention squad. In this respect, the Roman Inquisition follows the course of its head, Pope Pius XII. The Pope had only very cautiously voiced disapproval of the crimes committed by the Nazis. However, the Pope and the Inquisition do not mince words when it comes to the Red Menace. Any Catholic who actively supports the communist cause is threatened with excommunication and expulsion from the Church.
And thus it was decreed that those who actively took up the communist cause were to be treated as non-Christians. All in all, the wording of the decree was perhaps overly forceful, but it seems to have helped. For the Democrazia Cristiana won the election on April the 18th, 1948.
As a matter of fact, the conservative Christian Democrats win a sensational absolute majority, unique in the history of Italy. Ottaviani's policy was crucial to their victory. A few years later, Ottaviani becomes pro-prefect of the Holy Office, a man who answers only to the Pope. If the communists had won this fateful election, European history would have taken a very different course.
The Church has the right to defend itself. It defends the truth, not itself.
This defense is also directed inward. One of the new generation of priests in the 1950s is the Swiss theologian Hans Küng. His writings come to the attention of Ottaviani and the infamous Index of Prohibited Books.
My Inquisition number and later transcript number, which I still have, is 399-57I. The I stands for Index, Department for Prohibited Books, and it is the 399th file in 1957.
Semper idem, always the same, is Ottaviani's motto. But the young generation now pushing to the fore is no longer willing to accept this rigid stance.
I won his heart when we were in the midst of a difficult discussion. I guess he appreciated it when I said, "Your Eminence can say something too." And he replied, "Yes, yes." And I said, "Your Eminence, I'm still young." The half-blind cardinal's eyes lit up and he said, "Yes, you are young. And when I was young, I also said many things I shouldn't have."
Und als ich jung war, da habe ich natürlich auch vieles gesagt, was man nicht hätte sagen sollen.
Suddenly I realized that this man who struck such fear into people's hearts had a heart too, if you knew how to talk to him. But woe unto you if you were involved in a trial of faith, then you wouldn't have known that that heart was there.
A man every bit as ambitious and brilliant as Küng is Joseph Ratzinger. As the youngest theology professor in Germany up to this time, his name stands for the changing of the guard. He believes the Inquisition has to change.
At the time, I was convinced, and not entirely without reason, that the methods still employed by the Holy Office were not appropriate, did not correspond to the conception of legality in our time.
In February 1959, Pope John XXIII surprises the world by announcing a council, a meeting of all Catholic bishops in the world. Innovation and change. Up to now, only few bishops have raised such demands. For the arch-conservative Curia surrounding Ottaviani, the Church is just perfect as it is. As the head of the Theological Committee, one of the Vatican Council's most influential, Ottaviani thinks he can avert all innovations. But he is wrong. For both Küng and Ratzinger, the Second Vatican Council would prove to be a formative experience.
We were the two youngest at the council by far.
Of course, it all made a truly huge impression, I must say. You felt history in the making. You realized that this was an historical moment. It made you feel very small, but also very grateful to be allowed to be part of it, to contribute to it.
Und zugleich sehr dankbar ist, dass man doch ihm zugehören darf und dass man in ihm mitwirken darf.
Ratzinger is an advisor to Cardinal Frings from Cologne, one of the most influential personalities at the Vatican Council, and thus is caught in the center of controversy.
At the council, we both found ourselves on the same progressive front. And after the council, Ratzinger held speeches in which he basically, actually not basically, but most definitely spoke out against the system. He called it a scandal to defend narrow-minded clinging to old ways under the pretext of the unchangeable nature of the faith, or something along those lines. Hat das genannt, die ewige Gestrigkeit verteidige.
In April 1963, John XXIII, who had wanted to break up the fossilized structure of the Church, succumbs to cancer. The Second Vatican Council, which had just begun, seems doomed to fail. Cardinal Ottaviani himself places the tiara on the new Pope's head. But despite stiff resistance, and to the horror of the conservative faction, Pope Paul VI decides to continue the council. That same year, Cardinal Frings makes waves with a speech at the council against the Inquisition.
Es kam dann so, dass in
the second session, Cardinal Frings, who was after all already 78 years old, I remember the day he spoke up in St. Peter's about the Holy Office in his somewhat too high voice. It sounded rather shrill, but nevertheless very convincing. You could have heard a pin drop.
Da hätten Sie eine Nadel fallen hören können. Und hat deutlich angegriffen, dass
he criticized strongly that this congregation, the Holy Office, was not subject to church law, but was deemed above it. He also asserted that it was wrong to condemn people without hearing them first. The criticism was loud and clear, and when he was finished, the applause was thundering, which must have been quite a shock to Ottaviani, who was there to witness all this.
Einen ungeheuren Schock bedeutet hat.
Cardinal Frings did not pen this shocking speech himself. It had been written by his advisor, Josef Ratzinger. Suddenly, the name Ratzinger was known all the way up to the upper echelon of the Curia. The speech he had written was to have consequences that could not have been foreseen. In 1965, on the evening before the end of the Second Vatican Council, Pope Paul VI announces the end of the 400-year-old Roman Inquisition in its established form. It was to lose its absolute power and receive a new name, the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith.
Die Folge war, the
result, which we for the most part welcomed, was that the Holy Office was demoted to the status of a normal congregation. It was no longer the supreme congregation, and this upset Ottaviani no end. He believed that someone in the church should be in a position to decide what the truth is in cases of controversy. And for him, that was the Suprema Congregatio, before which even the popes trembled. The demotion was quite a shock, both for the Holy Office itself and for Ottaviani and his circle.
You could sense a certain inner greatness about him. After my speech, there had been a heated debate in the assembly hall, and after that, the two ran into each other at the bar. Ottaviani went to Frings and said, "We want the same thing. We are friends." I consider it a sign of inner greatness that he reacted so graciously to something which he must have perceived as an attack on his entire period in office.
Einer Sache, die natürlich schon als Angriff auf seine ganze Amtsführung auffassen musste, war doch etwas menschlich sehr Großes.
Cardinal Ottaviani will never recover from this defeat. Granted, he does become head of the new organization, but he seems unable to adapt to the times. Bitter and resigned, he eventually hands in his notice before he is relieved of his duties.
After that, the cardinal came to realize, more and more, that it was time for a change. Time for someone else to replace him. He wasn't weary initially, but they tired him out.
Parts of the church drift ever further away from Ottaviani's ideals. There was a grassroots movement demanding democratization of the church and even a say for parishes in choosing priests. This movement finds a prominent advocate in the abbot of St. Paul's just outside Rome, one of the most venerable of Catholic churches. Giovanni Franzoni had been the youngest participant at the Second Vatican Council. He soon realized that the desire for change permeating the general mood after the council had the potential to generate serious conflict.
At the council, We had been infected with a strange disease, a craze for unanimity, that demanded that all documents had to be approved unanimously, or at least almost unanimously. In order to achieve this, everything approved at the Council was full of ifs and buts. If historical conditions allow, if the bishop agrees, if Rome agrees, then this or that can be done. Everyone left convinced that somehow his own position had been legitimized.
Sotto l'ascella, pensando di seguitare la propria esperienza.
The Church's efforts for reform recede into the background in the face of the turmoil sweeping Europe in 1968. The universities are at the center of the upheaval, and this includes divinity schools and theology departments.
Wir protestieren gegen diese Konferenz, meine Damen und Herren. Die
Church reformers such as theology professor Josef Ratzinger are forced to acknowledge that something very different is happening here from the kind of change they had been hoping for.
Ich glaube, dass sie damals viele Professoren mit Recht geärgert haben.
I think many professors at the time were rightly angered at the forced interruption of their classes by people who had no business being there. They were staged almost like raids. Ratzinger was not the type of man to fight, fists clenched for control of the microphone. He was quite shocked back then that even some people from his own inner circle harbored sympathies for the radicals. And there's no doubt about it, from that time on, Josef Ratzinger set his sights on a career in the church hierarchy.
Not so Hans Küng. In his treatise Infallible, he criticizes the doctrine of the infallibility of the Pope in matters of faith, and thus undermines the very foundation of ecclesiastical authority. The Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith investigates Küng, a professor of Catholic theology, for 10 years before it decides to strike.
Die Vatikanische Glaubenskongregation, früher als Inquisitionsbehörde berüchtigt, entzog dem Tübinger Theologen Hans Küng die Lehrbefugnis.
Ich halte es für ein Skandal, dass
It's scandalous that in a church that derives its authority from Jesus Christ, a church that in recent years has professed its commitment to defending human rights, Inquisition trials are still being held in the 20th century. I still have not been granted access to my files. No one is ever allowed to see those files. That's why the Vatican cannot sign the European Council's Human Rights Declaration. When I was in Strasbourg, the seat of the European Council, and asked why the Pope wouldn't sign, I was told they would have to change a lot, particularly those appalling religious trials that still take place behind the thick walls of the Holy Office, right next to St. Peter's Basilica.
Theologians from all over the world protest against Küng's trial. Josef Ratzinger, on the other hand, has switched sides and is now a cardinal. In 1981, Pope John Paul II appoints him prefect of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, the Inquisition's successor organization. What had become of the spirit of the great speech against the Inquisition that Ratzinger himself had written so many years ago?
I'll admit
that many say that it applies to the current situation and that we would do well to take heed of it today. I'm also the first to admit that we make mistakes, that not everything we do is perfect. But on the other hand, I'd also like to see those who use that speech to criticize us acknowledge the fact that we make every effort to honor the rights of those accused of opposing the faith, or of somehow falsifying or threatening it.
Places like this on the Via Ostiense in Rome are the final place of retreat for those who, in the opinion of the Curia, are a threat to the faith. Giovanni Franzoni leads a small parish here. He has first-hand experience of how the Church deals with deviants.
The isolation and elimination from the church are done almost as if on automatic pilot. I don't believe there is a handbook or anything on how to isolate people. First, there are warnings, exhortations to change one's way of thinking, one's opinion. I suppose that's the first step. They want the person to change his mind of his own accord.
Giovanni Franzoni does not change his mind of his own accord. It was his outspokenness in demanding a radical democratization of the church that had got him into trouble. He is subjected to the next stages of discipline and reacts accordingly. He resigns from his position and gets married.
The next phase is different. There are public admonitions, or you are pressured into correcting your thinking. The lowest level, if you want to consider that a punitive measure, is that the author is asked to write an article clarifying his position. Let's say he has written something that is truly contentious and wrong. Then we tell him to set the record straight.
The hierarchy's request to the former Abbot Franzoni is in vain. In the opinion of the prefect of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, Cardinal Ratzinger, things could be no different in a case like this, for he believes that without recognition by a higher authority, the whole structure of the Catholic Church would collapse.
If I am exercising authority, it is very important that I do not try to push through my own personal theories. They are only as legitimate as the arguments supporting them. But the Church was created and founded by a higher authority. It doesn't support personal theories we devise and happen to think are the best. It has a legacy to maintain.
It's an enormous legacy that the Church upholds today, in both a positive and a negative sense. Only a few years ago, a Grand Inquisitor such as Ottaviani could, without reservations, counter any difference of opinion with exclusion and bans. At first glance, the procedure today is far more moderate.
Complete and final excommunication has not occurred in recent years. But there is a form of isolation that corresponds to the stake in medieval times. It's a spiritual stake, an ideological stake.
It's always the same. The people are summoned to appear. If they go, which I didn't, their only option is to sign what is presented to them, or else to refuse, with all the sanctions that go along with that. No one stands a chance before that court. The work of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith under Cardinal Ratzinger is divided up among 4 divisions. One supervises the purity of Catholic doctrine. The second is concerned with punishing moral transgressions by the clergy, particularly those of a sexual nature. Another deals with matters pertaining to marriage, and the last with the phenomenon of miracles. The trials are held and the sentence is passed here in the courtroom.
In describing the Church's structure, I should mention that the congregation is also a tribunal, or in other words, it can constitute a court that operates according to strict procedural methods.
In the 1980s, Cardinal Ratzinger used these very methods to wage the fight against the proponents of liberation theology in South America. They fight side by side with communists against poverty and misery. They preach a church of the people and see Jesus as akin to Marx. They're also not afraid to use the term class struggle. This is an existential problem for the Curia. Almost half of the world's Catholics live in South America, and a schism starting here would mean the end of a global church. In several decrees, Cardinal Ratzinger condemns the ideas of liberation theology.
Was die Befreiungstheologie angeht, so hat
As far as liberation theology is concerned, things start to go off course when the ministry of the Church itself, and not just theology, is politicized. A politicization would allow Christians to support only one party, would allow only one direction of political action, so that in the end the salvation of the world would no longer be in the Lord's hands, but would be affected by politics. I believe this is incompatible with the faith and really needs to be corrected.
mit dem Glauben unvereinbar ist, das wirklicher Korrektur bedarf.
In the harsh reality of South America, salvation by the Lord seems a long way off. Some of the clergy there openly embrace quasi-feudal big landowners and armed forces as dubious allies in their battle against Marxism. In the 1980s, dictators even thanked the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith for its courageous words against those who would misunderstand Jesus as an agitator. On the other side, there are thousands of priests and nuns who have battled against social injustice and paid for it with their lives, killed by death squads. The murderers call themselves devout Christians and do not even hesitate to kill the Salvadoran Archbishop Oscar Romero. The Curia's lack of sympathy enrages liberation theologian Leonardo Boff. In his book, Charisma and Power, he even goes so far as to compare the Vatican with the Stalinist Communist Party. Cardinal Ratzinger will not stand for this insult. Boff is summoned to the Palace of the Holy Office in Rome. Once there, he refuses to recant and is promptly punished.
We asked him to refrain from traveling around the world to give lectures for 1 year. He could have continued teaching at the university, but he didn't. In our opinion, he is too garrulous. In light of the questions raised by his writings, we thought it would be a good idea for him to take a break from the lecture circuit, to grant himself a sabbatical, so to speak, and take some time to think about what we had pointed out to him.
After thinking things over and being engaged in a drawn-out battle with the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, Leonardo Boff decides to leave the priesthood, as do many other supporters of liberation theology. In 1989, the socialist world order collapses, and with it, the hopes for a just society according to the Marxist model. This is an unexpected boost for the positions of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. The majority of the faithful turn away from solidarity with the poor as preached by liberation theologians. The problems that the originators of liberation theology had tried to address in the 1960s remain unsolved today. For the Congregation of the Doctrine of the Faith, this is nevertheless proof of the success of their unyielding stance. Cardinal Trujillo is the only South American member of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. He also belongs to the Opus Dei, and he is an adamant opponent of liberation theology.
One always speaks of the economically poor, such as the poor in South American Indian theology today. But the poor, innocent unborn, that are slaughtered in abortions, the poor disabled, the poor subjected to the ideological pressure of the assault on life, as in euthanasia, for example, those poor they never speak of.
Dell'attentato contro la vita, per esempio, nella eutanasia, di questo mai parlano.
Sao Paulo in Brazil, a megalopolis of approximately 20 million inhabitants, is one of the fastest growing cities in the world. In faraway Rome, the Vatican deplores the sufferings of the people in the South American slums. Social problems have increased in recent years due to the spread of AIDS. But the means to alleviate this suffering are often at odds with traditional Catholic morals. The Church is caught up in a deep conflict, one that has painfully direct consequences for Italian missionary Valeriano Paitoni, who leads a congregation on the edge of Sao Paulo's slums.
Rome is very concerned that the values fundamental to our Christian faith, which I also believe in firmly, are really upheld. We who work here in the real world, that is, with the simple people, and who see the practical side of things, often find it extremely difficult to accept the directives that come from Rome. In Rome, they too rarely wait for the human beings to learn and grow. After all, we're not dealing with angels, but with human beings.
Respeitar a caminhada e o crescimento de uma pessoa humana. Nós não estamos lidando com anjos, nós estamos lidando com pessoas humanas.
Millions in Brazil have been infected with AIDS, and more than 100,000 have already died as a result of the disease. The Roman Curia only recognizes a sole antidote: complete sexual abstinence. Even married couples are forbidden to use condoms if one of the partners is infected with AIDS. Public outrage in this matter has up to now not impressed the Vatican.
Qual è la serietà di un mondo che parla così?
Where is the integrity of those who present things to the public in a way that is simply untrue? Who paint a picture of the Church as inflexible, negative, always quick to say no? Don't they see that the only means to combat AIDS is marital fidelity and respect for the dignity of women?
Veramente la piaga dell'AIDS o del SIDA è la fedeltà matrimoniale e il rispetto alle donne.
Faz 2000 anos, que o Cristo
Christ came to earth 2,000 years ago, and the Church has been preaching the commandment of marital fidelity for just as long. But I can't say if we've really made much progress on that front. Sometimes I joke that I'm not sure what has more holes, a condom or the fidelity that we preach day for day.
A camisinha, ou a fidelidade que nós pregamos.
Father Paitoni is in charge of 3 social projects for adults and children with AIDS. His practical work has taught him that he can only help the people here if he resists certain instructions from Rome. Paitoni exhorts his AIDS-infected parishioners to use condoms. However, pressure from the congregation in Rome has been mounting, forbidding him to do this. In Brazil, many consider Paitoni a hero who has initiated the schism of the little shirts, as condoms are called here.
This image sums up my life in a way. All holy men and women defended life, each in their own way, in their own time. Today, condoms are the only way we can slow the AIDS epidemic. Just as they did back then, we today defend life in our own way, with condoms.
The dispute over condoms is just one of many hardly resolvable conflicts that the congregation in Rome deals with. In Germany, the debate over the participation of Catholic agencies in government-required counseling designed to inform pregnant women of all their alternatives before they can legally seek an abortion has deeply divided the Catholic Church. The Roman Church's relationship to other faiths and other Christian denominations is troubled. And then there is genetic engineering, with its unforeseeable consequences for our conception of humankind. Cardinal Ratzinger has been at the head of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith for over 20 years. The once shy scholar has become a man who relishes power. The public image of Ratzinger, particularly in his home country of Germany, is a distorted one, conforming to the stereotype of an inquisitor.
Es wäre falsch, zum Beispiel zu behaupten, wie es oft passiert, dass der Papst oben steht und Kardinal Ratzinger sein Weißhund sei.
Jedenfalls versuche ich es.
At least I try not to be. Although, of course, a cardinal's responsibilities include deflecting criticism so that it doesn't fall so directly on the Pope. I think it's wise to keep the Pope out of the fray and have the blows land at the doorstep of the next one down. That way, the Pope can remain the father of all, someone people can look up to, even if they don't approve of everything. But the image of me as someone who lashes out and enjoys making trouble for mankind, to the embarrassment of the good Pope, who would rather that things were different, that is, indeed, a caricature.
For years, the Cardinal has surrounded himself with a group of young scholars from all over the world who support their prefect completely. They know and esteem Ratzinger's other side, his enormous theological talent. One of the main figures in this new generation is the head of the secret archives, the Spaniard Monsignor Alejandro Cifres.
I was a priest in a small village and was preparing to study in Rome. My bishop approached me and said, instead of studying, you could pursue a different path and work with Cardinal Ratzinger in the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith in Rome. I was absolutely overwhelmed. I was rendered completely speechless. For Cardinal Ratzinger was everything to me, young theology student that I was, just everything. The Holy See, the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, had an almost mystical status. So I stood there, unable to say a word, until finally I managed to tell the bishop that I would do whatever was best for the diocese. And that's how I ended up here.
As notary of the congregation, Monsignor Cifres himself conducts religious trials, until in 1998, Cardinal Ratzinger assigns him to a bold undertaking, opening the archives of the Inquisition to researchers. Ratzinger's move is opposed by large sections of the clergy. It is a unique moment in history, for the archives are no dead library. The old files attest to the continuity of the faith. One could almost say they are inhabited by something akin to the soul of the Inquisition.
None of us actually had any real idea of what is stored in the archives. Opening the archives, which task was eventually assigned to me, was a real adventure. It was almost like jumping into a black hole.
The former Inquisition would not be the world's oldest still-functioning secret service if it divulged all its secrets. Files dating from later than 1903 still remain closed today, and that's not all.
All archives, of whatever kind, have a special department for those files which, either because of their value or because of their extremely delicate nature, must be held back, even from internal users. We, too, have a small archive where certain top-secret items are stored. The Cardinal keeps the key.
dove si conservano certe cose di questo tenore.
In some cases, confessions were recorded. They must continue to enjoy full protection. It was no easy task to separate this material from other files and to ensure that the dignity and confidentiality of the sacrament of confession were preserved.
In earlier centuries, the Inquisition did at times break the seal of the confessional and thus violated a holy sacrament. That too is part of the legacy that Cardinal Ratzinger has to come to terms with today. The top secret files include those on the sexual transgressions of priests and accounts of miracles. The famous third prophecy of Fatima was one of the documents kept here. Today, a large part of the work of the modern Inquisition consists of investigating miracles. As is the case here in Lourdes in France, millions all over the world make pilgrimages to the sites of the mysteries, both those that are recognized by the Church and those that the people insist are sacred. For the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, the line between true faith and heretic superstition is a very fine one.
Today, we are experiencing not the end of religion, but rather its disintegration. Again, belief in magic is spreading, as are all kinds of critical philosophies and an obsession with the supernatural. People want the supernatural to become tangible. That is indeed a major problem for us. And I would say that we have about as much work cut out for us keeping these things on course and containing them as we do with debates waged with theologians.
Den wir mit den Theologen zu führen haben. Es geht nicht nur.
We would say this is not only about misguided teachings and rationalism, which we counter by defending the faith. It is also very much about these pathologies of religion, which are spreading enormously today.
The Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith is, just as the Inquisition used to be, skeptical toward miracles, and tends to view them as threats rather than as an enrichment for the Catholic Church. In the wake of this new belief in miracles, personal religions are gaining more and more ground. Many people today patch together their own system of beliefs from various elements and are refusing to bow to the strict rules of the Church. When they use elements taken from Catholicism, Cardinal Ratzinger intervenes. The flock is not allowed to believe just anything it wants. It is supposed to believe what the shepherds in Rome have approved. But it is exactly this ambitious claim that is at the root of the Inquisition's inadequacy. It is supposed to defend universal, eternal rules in a world where the rules are constantly changing. All Grand Inquisitors throughout history have had to grapple with this contradiction. Many began as impassioned reformers, like Cardinal Ratzinger, only to end up as preservers of the old order. We started out together, almost like twins, and continued along our way until our paths diverged. He reached for ecclesiastical power when it was offered to him, whereas I refused it. In my opinion, it wouldn't be right to get involved in that way until reforms have been implemented. Now he has achieved what he could achieve. I've achieved what I could achieve. I can only hope he's as happy as I am.
First of all, it is clear that there will always be differences of opinion among people. That's because no one sees the whole picture, which would lead to a kind of symphony of wisdom, as far as that is possible. On the other hand, that cannot mean that we no longer have any clear idea of what we believe. It would be a sad distortion of diversity and inner wealth if all that remained in the end was something amorphous that no one could really grasp, and if people no longer knew what they were affirming as Christians.
Ratzinger's motto is working for truth. It's an anachronistic truth, a truth with two sides. The dark side speaks of coercion and narrow-mindedness. The bright side paints a picture of a lone defender against the dangers of unconsidered change. Dark and light. Cardinal Ratzinger unites both in one person, the latest in a long line of great keepers of the faith.